Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the hospital ward, clinging to the walls like grief. Amarachi lay motionless on the hospital bed, her arms limp by her side, the white sheet rising and falling weakly with every shallow breath. Her eyes stared blankly at the pale ceiling, but her heart was crushed far deeper than any visible wound could reveal. The silence was thick until the door creaked open. In walked Nelson, her husband of nearly 2 decades, dressed immaculately in his designer suit. He didn't rush to her side, didn't ask how she was. He glanced at the 4-bag, then at her pale face, and finally down to her stomach, now hollow where life had once stirred. Then he laughed. Not the laugh of awkwardness or confusion, but a deliberate, sharp, cruel laugh. "Even your womb knows you're useless," he said, smirking as if she had dropped a glass and embarrassed him. Amarachi blinked slowly, a single tear rolling from the corner of her eye. That tear was not from the loss alone. It was from the realization that the man who once promised her forever now saw her as nothing more than a failed investment. Nelson's voice cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. "What a shame," he said, circling the bed like a predator who had no more interest in the hunt. "You really thought having another baby would change anything? You were never going to matter." Amarachi didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat was dry, her body aching not just from the miscarriage, but from months of emotional erosion. For weeks during the pregnancy, Nelson had treated her with contempt, ignoring her, yelling at her over trivial things, constantly threatening divorce. Yet through it all, she had hoped that maybe when the baby arrived, he would soften. That maybe, just maybe, she would get a sliver of the man she once believed she loved. But now, lying there with her baby gone and her husband gloating, that last fragile hope shattered like glass in a storm. She wanted to scream, to cry, to rage, but all she could do was breathe. Unbeknownst to them both, standing just outside the door, their 17-year-old son, Daniel, had heard every word. He had come to check on his mother after school, flowers clutched nervously in hand, hoping she'd smile even in her pain. But instead, he froze at the sound of his father's laughter, his world tilting with every vile word, his breath caught in his throat. He had always known his father was harsh, but this was something else. He looked through the small glass panel in the door and saw the woman who had raised him, fed him, loved him even when she had nothing left to give, now reduced to silence and tears. A fire lit inside him, a silent promise. As Nelson turned and strutted out of the room, past his son without a glance, Daniel took a step back. He knew, in that moment, that he would never be like his father, and one day he would make sure his mother never had to bow her head again. Years before that hospital room and Nelson's cruel laughter, there was a young woman full of dreams and warmth. Amarachi had been a rising star in her marketing firm, a brilliant strategist with a calm presence and radiant charm. She was admired for her work ethic and loved by many for her ability to uplift others without dimming herself. That was when she met Nelson. He was a scruffy, determined entrepreneur running a failing logistics startup from a single-room office above a leaking shop. He was charming but rough around the edges, arrogant in that way that masked insecurity. Most women dismissed him, but Amarachi saw something else, a man with vision who needed someone to believe in him. And so she did. What began as friendship grew into something deeper. She spent weekends helping him organize proposals, used her contacts to get him meetings, and even lent him money to buy his first proper delivery van. In the early days, he was humble, grateful even. "I'd be nowhere without you," he once whispered to her during a rainy night when she stayed to help pack goods until 2 a.m. Amarachi smiled, not knowing those words would become a bitter memory. Their relationship deepened naturally. Amarachi wasn't looking for grand gestures. She valued intention, vision, and consistency, things she believed Nelson had. When he struggled to pay staff, she helped balance the books. When he was mocked by competitors, she stood by him like a pillar. At work, she was a boss. At his side, she was a helper. And, in her heart, She was a believer, one who was slowly falling in love. When they made love for the first time, it wasn't planned. It happened after they secured their first major client and celebrated in his tiny office, sharing drinks and laughter. Weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. Her heart leaped with a strange blend of joy and fear. She hadn't planned it, but she welcomed it. Nelson, on the other hand, sat in silence when she told him, his expression unreadable. He didn't yell. He didn't hug her either. He simply said, "Okay, we'll do what we have to do," and that was it. No proposal. No excitement. Just a reluctant acceptance, one that would set the tone for the rest of their life together. Their wedding was quiet, held at the registry with only a handful of friends. Nelson barely smiled during the photos, already focused on work calls. Amarachi wore a borrowed cream dress and held a simple bouquet. She smiled in every photo, not for the camera, but because she believed in the stories she was writing with him. Love, to her, was sacrifice, partnership, building something together. She ignored the whispers, the friends who asked, "Are you sure he loves you?" She chose faith over fear, convinced that love could be earned through loyalty and consistency. After all, hadn't she helped him build a dream already? What more could prove devotion? But as she would later learn, building a man's world does not guarantee you a place in it. Amarachi settled into married life with quiet determination. She was 6 months pregnant and still working full-time at her firm, even while helping Nelson manage logistics and draft client proposals. Her days were long, but she moved with grace, checking inventory in the morning, heading to meetings during the day, and returning home to cook dinner before falling asleep with swollen feet. Nelson, now enjoying early success from her networking efforts, began taking longer calls, traveling more, and spending less time at home. Still, Amarachi didn't complain. She believed that sacrifice was part of growth, and she was determined to be the strong wife behind a rising man. She often told herself, "This is just the beginning. When things settle, we'll have our moment." But with every passing week, that moment never came. The pregnancy was not easy, complicated by high blood pressure and swollen ankles. But Amarachi endured it all with a silent, enduring strength. Nelson rarely accompanied her to the hospital. When he did, he sat distracted, responding to emails or leaving midway through appointments. Her baby shower was organized by colleagues at her office. Nelson showed up 2 hours late, already tipsy from another party. "Sorry," he muttered, handing her a fancy baby gift he clearly didn't pick out. Amarachi smiled through the celebration, holding her belly protectively. That night, when they got home, she asked if he was happy. Nelson shrugged. "I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Isn't that enough?" She turned away, tears stinging her eyes, and placed a hand on her belly. "You're enough," she whispered to the child growing inside her. "If no one else is, you are." When their son Daniel was born, Nelson's demeanor changed, but not toward her. He was elated, but it was all about the boy. "My heir," he declared, calling friends, posting pictures of himself holding the child, and buying expensive gifts. Amarachi watched from her hospital bed as he soaked in the glory, never once thanking her, never once acknowledging the pain she endured to bring that child into the world. The naming ceremony was lavish. Nelson hired a hall, invited politicians and investors, and gave speeches that framed him as the ultimate provider. Amarachi was paraded like a decorative prize, smiling in public, broken in private. When she tried to take a photo alone with Daniel, he pulled the baby back for more solo shots of himself. That night, after everyone left, she sat in the dark nursery, rocking Daniel slowly. Her tears wet his tiny blanket, but she sang to him anyway. Because no matter what the world took from her, she would never let it take her love for him. The arrival of Daniel shifted Amarachi's world entirely. She dedicated herself fully to motherhood, waking up every 2 hours to breastfeed, learning his patterns, soothing his cries, and holding him through long nights of teething and fever. She wore her exhaustion like a badge of honor, because to her, this child was everything, her only evidence that something good could come from the pain she endured. But for Nelson, Daniel's birth marked something different, the completion of an obligation. Now that he had a male heir, the pressure to maintain appearances was gone. He didn't hide his growing coldness anymore. He spent less time at home, claiming business travel or networking events. On the rare days he stayed home, he barely held Daniel, more interested in his phone than his son's cooing or milestones. Amarachi would often watch him from the hallway. Her husband, once desperate for success, now bathing in attention from the world while ignoring the life they built together. Nelson's ego grew with each business success, and Amarachi found herself becoming more and more invisible. She was no longer his partner in growth, just Daniel's mother, or the woman at home. He'd introduce her coldly at functions with a stiff nod, and even when she looked stunning, dressed in gowns she bought with her own savings, his eyes were always scanning the crowd for someone younger, someone newer. When she spoke, he cut her off. When she suggested business ideas or strategies, he waved her away as though she were an annoying fly. "Leave that to the men," he once said in front of others. The humiliation stung deeply, not just because of the insult, but because many of those men in the room were her former contacts, people she once introduced him to. Amarachi often walked home from those events crying silently in the back seat, while Nelson chatted on his phone, sometimes even texting women right beside her. And yet she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because she still held onto hope that the man she met in that leaking office upstairs, the man who once whispered, "I'd be nowhere without you," was still in there somewhere. She believed in healing, in the long game, in giving time a chance to soften hearts. Her love wasn't desperate, it was disciplined. She didn't fight him for attention or argue with the women who started appearing in his life. She simply focused on Daniel, pouring her everything into raising a boy who would grow up knowing kindness, strength, and purpose. But deep within her, a quiet sadness took root. She began journaling, something she hadn't done in years. Late at night, she'd write prayers into the pages, along with her fears. "Lord, don't let my love become the thing that destroys me." It was the kind of hope only a woman bleeding silently could understand. The success of Nelson's logistics empire did not happen overnight, nor did it happen in isolation. Long before the business became a household name, it was Amarachi who designed his first business logo, who convinced her ex-colleagues to give him a chance, and who called in favors from her marketing contacts to promote his brand. When staff didn't show up, she packed and labeled cartons herself. When trucks broke down, she rode with the drivers through the night to reassure clients. It wasn't glamorous, but it was love. She didn't ask for praise. She simply wanted the dream they'd built to succeed. But the more successful the company became, the more Nelson erased her from its history. He'd speak at conferences and describe himself as a self-made man. Interviews would credit his resilience and genius, while Amarachi sat in the audience with Daniel on her lap, knowing the truth. At home, Amarachi still handled invoices and double-checked inventory orders. But Nelson had started hiring young female assistants and brand consultants who barely lasted 3 months before being replaced with someone prettier. These women started calling her ma'am, in that awkward way that let her know she was seen as an outdated figure, present but invisible. Nelson, now constantly surrounded by praise and attention, began treating Amarachi like a domestic staff member. "What's for dinner?" became a demand, not a question. "You forgot to iron my shirt," came with a raised voice. She, the woman who had written his first proposal by hand, was now just a shadow in the mansion she helped build. And yet, Amarachi remained composed. She didn't retaliate or throw things or scream. She simply carried the weight of being everything to a man who treated her like nothing. There were times when friends suggested she leave, especially Linda, who had grown cold toward Nelson ever since the attempted seduction. "You're better than this, Amarachi. You've done more than most wives ever could," Linda once said after Amarachi confided about Nelson's latest cruelty. But Amarachi would shake her head. "Daniel needs both of us, and if I leave now, I leave without a voice or a name." It wasn't fear that kept her, it was foresight. Amarachi knew the world would believe Nelson before it believed her. He was a powerful man now, respected, feared, and adored. If she left without proof, her sacrifice would be rewritten as failure. And so she stayed biding time, quietly studying, quietly observing, quietly remembering. Because one day she knew everything would change. And when it did, she would not raise her voice. She would not scream. She would simply bring the truth to the table and let it burn the lies to ash. It began with whispers, small, biting conversations that ended when Amarachi entered the room. The women at events would glance at her, smile thinly, and return to their champagne flutes with knowing eyes. Nelson no longer bothered to pretend. At galas, he arrived with young models, introducing them as business consultants or brand strategists. One time, he had the audacity to bring a date to an event hosted by a company Amarachi helped him win. She stood across the ballroom, dressed in a regal gold gown she saved for months to buy, only to watch her husband kiss another woman's hand in front of the media. The humiliation settled in her chest like wet cement. When someone asked, "Is that your husband?" she smiled and replied, "Yes, that's my husband. And I'm the reason he's here." But inside, she was crumbling. At one particular charity gala, Amarachi was seated at a table with wives of other business moguls. One asked her with a mocking grin, "So do you still work?" Amarachi, adjusting her necklace, replied calmly, "No, I'm retired now. But I helped build the company you all came here to sponsor." The woman blinked, slightly taken aback. But before the awkward silence could end, Nelson passed their table with a different woman on his arm, one who looked young enough to be their daughter. He didn't even glance at Amarachi. The other wives giggled behind napkins. That night, when Amarachi returned home alone, Nelson having gone to a private business dinner, she sat in front of her vanity and stared at her reflection, not at her face, but at her eyes. And for the first time, she didn't see a wife. She saw a woman who had been turned into a prop in her own life. Still, she didn't confront him. She didn't yell or pack a bag. She tucked her pain into her pillow and kissed her son good night. Daniel, now a teenager, had begun to see the cracks. He noticed his mother's long stares and his father's dismissiveness. Once, after Nelson left for a weekend trip with no explanation, Daniel asked, "Mom, why does Dad treat you like this?" Amarachi had no words. She simply hugged him tightly and whispered, "Because he never saw me as treasure. But you do, and that's enough for now." But even as she said it, she knew the time for silence was slowly ending. She was no longer just enduring for love. She was collecting wounds that would one day become weapons. And when the final blow would land, it wouldn't be loud. It would be surgical, precise, and unforgettable. Linda had known Amarachi since their university days, inseparable roommates, sisters in everything but blood. She had been one of the few who stood beside Amarachi during the early days of her marriage, even when others whispered about Nelson's lack of affection. In fact, it was Linda who helped Amarachi prepare the surprise dinner that celebrated Nelson's first company profit. So when Nelson started growing distant and Amarachi needed someone to talk to, she confided in Linda. The two women often met over lunch or tea, with Amarachi pouring out the silent wounds of her marriage, how Nelson had become cold, how he barely spoke unless to command, how she no longer felt like a wife, but more like an employee in her own home. Linda listened with patience and a growing knot in her stomach, biting back words that she knew would only cause more pain. Because deep down, Linda had noticed something Amarachi hadn't yet realized. Nelson's wandering gaze wasn't just for strangers. It had started turning toward her. The first time it happened was during a company brunch. Linda had come straight from a business trip to deliver reports Amarachi had asked for. Nelson had smiled too long. His hug had lingered too close. At first, she thought she imagined it. But then came the late-night texts supposedly asking for advice, sent under the guise of business. She ignored them. Then came an uninvited lunch, where Nelson spent the entire time speaking poorly of Amarachi, calling her boring, too tired, and unambitious. Linda listened in stunned silence, her stomach turning. And then came the moment she'd never forget. At a fundraising event for an orphanage Amarachi supported, Nelson had cornered her outside the restroom, leaned close, and whispered, "I married the wrong friend." Linda froze. She shoved him back gently, composed her face, and returned to the hall without a word. But the betrayal crawled under her skin like a sickness. Nelson had not only insulted Amarachi's loyalty, he had used her pain as a door to infidelity. Linda debated whether to tell Amarachi the truth. Her friend was already suffering so much. How could she pile on more heartbreak? Eventually, the truth weighed too heavily, and during one quiet visit, she told her. Amarachi listened in complete silence, her hands trembling slightly, but her face unreadable. "Did he touch you?" she asked softly. Linda shook her head. "No. I stopped it before it even got that far. But he tried. And he didn't regret it." Amarachi stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked outside. Then, in a whisper only Linda could hear, she said, "You're the second woman to tell me he crossed the line. And I think I know how to end this. Not with noise. With precision." Linda left that evening shaken, knowing something had changed. Amarachi was no longer trying to save her marriage. She was preparing for war. The next few weeks became a dangerous game of emotional chess. Amarachi, having finally accepted that her marriage was not just broken but poisonous, began to pull back emotionally. She no longer initiated conversation, no longer asked about Nelson's whereabouts, and no longer pretended to be shocked when he didn't come home. Her silence unnerved him. He was used to her tears, her pleas, her patient devotion. Now, she simply nodded when he spoke and avoided unnecessary words. And that silence, that unnerving composure, was what drove Nelson to explode. One evening, as she served him dinner in silence, he pushed the plate aside and slammed the table. "Who do you think you are, walking around like some queen in a palace I built?" Amarachi didn't flinch. She simply looked him in the eyes and replied, "I'm the woman who helped you build the bricks you now sit on." That was the first time she'd raised her voice in years. And Nelson, feeling the balance of power shifting, decided to strike where it would hurt most. The following day, he presented her with a document, a divorce threat. "You're free to leave, Amarachi," he said coolly. "But just so we're clear, you get nothing. Remember that prenup you signed before our son was born." He dropped a copy of it on the table. Amarachi stared at it, her fingers not moving, her breath steady. He continued, "This house, the cars, the company, none of it is in your name. You walk out with your clothes and whatever jewelry you bought yourself. I'll keep Daniel." That last line was where she blinked. He had no idea what their son meant to her, what it meant to threaten that bond. But she didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply picked up the document and replied, "Then you better get your lawyers ready." From that day forward, Amarachi didn't just endure. She began preparing. Because the man who once begged her to believe in him had now become her adversary. Amarachi secretly met with a friend who was a quiet, yet powerful, family lawyer. She asked about prenups, child custody, and financial protections. But more importantly, she began her own quiet investigation into something that had haunted her for years, the timeline of her son's birth. There had always been a moment of confusion when Daniel was born, blood results that didn't match, a conversation between two nurses that seemed odd. She had buried it at the time, too in love to entertain doubt. But now she needed truth, not just to fight back, but to reclaim her dignity. Nelson's threat had not silenced her, it had awakened her. She no longer saw herself as his wife. She saw herself as a woman who had been used, discarded, and now had one mission, to make sure he paid for every laugh, every slap of silence, and every moment he had stripped her bare. And this time, she wouldn't shout. She would break him with truth. Daniel had grown up in a home filled with contradictions. There was wealth, yes, but there was also absence. There were grand parties and international vacations, but never shared dinners. There were trophies on the wall, but never hugs after school. And through it all, one thing remained constant, his mother. Amarachi was his safe place, his mentor, his everything. As a boy, he watched her pack his lunch every morning and wait outside during his football practices. She taught him how to manage pocket money, how to write his first business plan, and how to look people in the eye when speaking. Nelson, on the other hand, was a ghost with a gold card. He showed up for birthdays, but never for heartbreaks. He gave expensive gifts, but no wisdom. Daniel had learned early to stop expecting anything from him. But nothing broke him like the day he stood at that hospital door and heard his father mock the woman who raised him. From that moment on, something inside Daniel hardened. He became more focused, more attentive, and more emotionally tied to his mother. He started studying the business more seriously, not for praise, but because he wanted to understand what she had helped build. He began keeping notes about conversations, copying files, and quietly watching how Nelson operated. In school, he excelled. At home, he withdrew from his father. Whenever Nelson tried to bond, Daniel would respond with short answers or silence. Amarachi noticed, but never interfered. She didn't poison him against his father. She simply let her son see for himself. And Daniel did. He saw how Nelson disrespected her. He saw how she cried in the kitchen, but still served dinner. He saw how she held her head high in public, but broke behind closed doors. And with every day, his loyalty to her deepened. At 17, Daniel was already running segments of the business during Nelson's frequent absences. Clients trusted him. Staff adored him. He was fair, intelligent, and humble. Everything Nelson wasn't. On his 18th birthday, Nelson hosted a massive event, more for himself than for Daniel. But that night, Daniel quietly slipped away from the celebration to sit with his mother in the backyard. They didn't say much, just held hands in the moonlight. Finally, he whispered, "Mom, I know everything, and whatever you need me to do, I'm ready." Amarachi didn't ask how much he knew. She didn't ask what he had planned. She simply looked at her son, the boy she raised, and smiled through tears. For the first time in years, she felt something stir in her again. Hope. Not just for justice, but for healing. The kind of healing that comes when the child you sacrificed everything for turns around and becomes your strength. As Nelson entered his late 40s, a new obsession took hold of him: legacy. He had built an empire, yes, but now he wanted to upgrade his life with a younger, more vibrant partner to match his wealth. To him, Amarachi was part of the old story, useful once, now outlived. With Daniel almost grown and the company thriving, he saw no more need to entertain the idea of a traditional marriage. Amarachi had become, in his eyes, a relic, a woman who no longer turned heads or stimulated his ego. She was beautiful but not flashy, intelligent but not showy, dignified but not submissive enough for his evolved tastes. So he began his new plan in secret. Quiet dinners with social media influencers, business consultations with beauty queens, and flirty weekend trips disguised as conferences. He fed the media images of a glamorous, powerful man, hinting at a personal rebranding, without directly announcing the fall of his marriage. In his mind, Amarachi would fade into the background just as easily as she once stepped into the spotlight to build him. What Nelson failed to realize was that his arrogance had made him careless. Amarachi noticed everything: the makeup stains on his travel shirts, the unfamiliar scents of women's perfume, the private calls he took in bathrooms late at night. She logged it all in silence. But she didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, she spent more time with Daniel, planting seeds of truth and wisdom in him. She began putting her own affairs in order, separating bank accounts, investing in silent partnerships under her name, and acquiring property outside Nelson's control. She hired a discreet lawyer and began drafting options for a private exit strategy, even as she continued to play the role of dutiful wife in public. It was not cowardice, it was precision. She didn't want an emotional outburst. She wanted a clean cut. But Nelson wasn't done yet. In a move that shocked even Amarachi, he rewrote his will, giving his entire estate, properties, and businesses to Daniel, bypassing Amarachi entirely. To him, it was a final insult. To her, it was an unexpected opportunity. When Amarachi eventually discovered the will through a legal assistant who had always admired her grace, she didn't react with anger. She smiled faintly, almost in relief. He had made the same mistake many powerful men do. He assumed the child was unquestionably his. But Amarachi knew the truth was far more complicated. And now, The proof she had begun searching for years ago had suddenly become essential. With Daniel's 18th birthday approaching and the company's control about to transfer, she reached out to the private investigator once more. "Proceed," she instructed calmly. "Let's finish what we started." Meanwhile, Nelson, fully convinced that he was in total control, began planning a quiet divorce announcement once Daniel officially assumed leadership. He envisioned his re-entry into bachelorhood with a new wife, a sleek narrative, and no resistance. But what he didn't know was that Amarachi was no longer playing to survive. She was planning to end the game entirely with truth. Amarachi stood frozen in the bathroom, her trembling fingers clutching the small white stick as the word pregnant blinked back at her in bold letters. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat, not out of joy or fear, but disbelief. At her age, after all the emotional and physical stress, she had never expected another child. Her heart fluttered, not because she wanted to use the pregnancy as leverage, but because she had always believed children were a gift. Alone in that quiet moment, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. But as soon as she told Nelson, the reality of her situation came crashing down. He didn't say a word at first. He simply stared at her for a long, agonizing minute, then scoffed and walked away. Later that evening, he returned with a tone colder than winter. "You think this will stop me from leaving? You think this baby changes anything? It doesn't," he spat. "This child will be mine. You will not be." Amarachi felt her knees weaken as she sat slowly on the edge of the bed, placing her hand on her belly. She had hoped, naively perhaps, that even the coldest heart could soften at the thought of new life. But Nelson wasn't just cold. He was calculated. He began acting more distant, sometimes outright hostile. He ignored her cravings, neglected hospital appointments, and refused to acknowledge the pregnancy to his friends. He carried on with his new woman, openly flirting with her even in Amarachi's presence. The disrespect wasn't even subtle anymore. It was weaponized. One evening, he handed Amarachi a folder, smirking. "This is a revised prenup. You'll sign it now that you're trying to trap me with another child. I've already spoken to lawyers. Once you give birth, you'll leave. I'll raise the child. You'll get nothing." Amarachi looked at the folder, but didn't open it. She didn't need to. She already knew his intentions. He saw her only as a vessel, a disposable one at that. But what Nelson didn't realize was that this pregnancy gave Amarachi something she hadn't had in a long time: clarity. She began to eat better, rest more, and attend every prenatal appointment with the quiet focus of a soldier preparing for battle. She documented everything: his threats, his absence, even the mistreatment at home. She kept a journal that detailed every moment of cruelty, carefully stored in a locked drawer. But more than anything, she began talking to the child in her belly. "I don't know how long we'll be together," she whispered during a particularly hard night, "but know this: you're loved. You were not a mistake." Her strength came not from revenge, but from resolve. She knew now that Nelson had nothing left to offer her but pain. But she also knew that pain could be turned into power. And when the day came, she wouldn't cry. She would confront him with the only thing he feared: truth. Winter came early that year, both outside and within the walls of Amarachi's home. The mansion that once echoed with laughter and footsteps now rang with silence, broken only by Nelson's occasional commands and Amarachi's quiet weeping in the bathroom. At 7 months pregnant, her belly had grown heavy, but the weight on her chest was far heavier. Nelson barely looked at her anymore. His once fiery ambition had become arrogance, and his treatment of Amarachi grew more inhumane by the day. He would walk past her in the hallway without acknowledgement, refuse to speak at dinner, and occasionally toss out cruel remarks under his breath. "Still waddling around like a bloated duck," he once muttered when she dropped a spoon. Amarachi blinked away the tears, turned, and continued eating in silence. Each word was a dagger, but she learned not to bleed. At night, the cold was unbearable, not because of the temperature, but because of the absence of care. Nelson slept in the guest wing, and Amarachi was left alone, clutching a hot water bottle to ease her back pains. Sometimes, Daniel would peek in and sit beside her, silently rubbing her swollen feet. Those moments kept her going. Once, she tried asking Nelson to drive her to the hospital for a scheduled scan. He looked at her and said, "Take the driver. I have more important things to do than babysit your stomach." That night, Amarachi returned home to find him entertaining guests, young women and business partners, drinking wine and laughing in a lounge. She walked past them quietly, her hand resting on her belly, her heart thudding not from jealousy, but from the crushing awareness that she was now invisible in a house she helped build. She began to write more frequently, letters to her unborn child, reflections on her life, prayers for Daniel, and pages filled with the kind of sorrow no one could see. One letter simply read, "If I don't make it out of this alive, let someone know I tried. Let someone know I loved with everything, even when I was given nothing." It wasn't drama, it was documentation. Amarachi had moved past anger. She was now living in a state of clarity. Every moment was preparation. Every insult was evidence. Every step was deliberate. The house that once mocked her with cold air and colder silence would one day echo with truth. And she knew the time was drawing near. Because no soul can be wounded endlessly without someday rising to break the hand that caused it. It happened on a Thursday morning. The skies were unusually dark for that time of day, a quiet storm brewing over the city. Amarachi had barely slept the night before. Sharp cramps had pierced her back throughout the night, but she dismissed them as the usual discomfort of late pregnancy. She pushed through her morning routine with effort, whispering soft words to the baby in her belly as she folded Daniel's laundry and made tea. But something felt wrong. Her legs felt heavy, her vision blurred occasionally, and by afternoon, the ache in her belly turned into tightening surges that made her grip the edge of the couch and scream silently into a pillow. Still, there was no one around. Nelson had taken an impromptu business retreat with one of his mistresses, and the domestic staff had been given the weekend off for reasons she was never informed about. Amarachi was alone when her water broke, and alone when she collapsed beside the kitchen sink, unable to even scream loud enough for help. By the time she arrived at the hospital, the doctors were rushing. Her blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and the baby's heartbeat was fading. The room was a flurry of panicked voices and rushed movements. Amarachi could barely keep her eyes open as she was wheeled into emergency care, oxygen strapped to her face, and a nurse pressing her hand for reassurance. In her semi-conscious state, Amarachi whispered to no one in particular, "Please save my baby." But it was too late. When she awoke hours later, the sterile brightness of the hospital's ceiling greeted her along with the dull, vacant ache of her womb. A nurse stood by with solemn eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered gently. "We couldn't save the baby." Amarachi didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply turned her head away, closed her eyes, and felt a piece of herself disintegrate into nothingness. The child she had loved, spoken to, and planned for was gone. And once again, she would leave the hospital with empty arms. When Nelson finally showed up, hours later, he didn't ask about her condition. He didn't offer a hug. He stood at the foot of her bed with a bitter smirk, hands in his designer trouser pockets, and shook his head. "All that fuss and you still failed," he muttered. "You really are cursed, Amarachi." She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. Her face remained turned toward the wall, where a single drop of fluid dangled at the end of a tube. His laughter, low and cruel, echoed in the room. "Maybe this is the universe's way of telling you to stop pretending you're still needed." At that moment, Daniel stood in the doorway, his fists clenched, his jaw locked. He had heard it all. He saw his mother, fragile, broken, and his father, a man he once admired, now stripped bare as a monster. Daniel didn't say a word. He simply turned around and walked away. Not in fear, but in fury. In that moment, both mother and son knew. Nelson had buried something far more dangerous than a dream. He had buried any reason to be forgiven. Recovery was slow, but Amarachi was no stranger to pain. She took her time, eating quietly, walking gently, and allowing the nurses to speak softly around her. She didn't talk much. The miscarriage had numbed her emotions in a way that made even the loudest sorrows feel like background noise. She would sit by the window of her hospital room, wrapped in a cream shawl, watching as the days passed and the skies changed. When visitors came, friends who offered shallow sympathy, she smiled politely, accepted their fruits and flowers, and said very little. But inside, something was shifting. The silence wasn't passive anymore. It was strategic. Amarachi was rebuilding herself, not with words or vengeance, but with patience. And when she was discharged 2 weeks later, she didn't return to the woman she was before. She returned with a quiet clarity and the will to finish what had long been in motion. Once home, she moved with grace, even in grief. She thanked the staff, resumed her role as Daniel's support system, and never once spoke about Nelson's absence during her recovery. He had sent no apology, offered no care, and held no regret. He continued living as if nothing had happened. And that suited her just fine. She resumed therapy sessions, but this time with a new therapist, one who specialized in trauma survivors and emotional detachment. For the first time in years, Amarachi spoke about her isolation, her humiliation, and the betrayal she had bottled for over a decade. The therapist, Dr. Ozioma, listened intently, never rushing her. "You've endured a long war in silence," she said one day. "But I don't think you're interested in surviving anymore. I think you're preparing to rise." Amarachi smiled faintly. That was exactly what she was doing. She called her private investigator again. "I need results. The DNA test we discussed years ago. I want it done now." Quietly, she handed over Daniel's used toothbrush and a sample Nelson had once discarded. "If the rumors I heard back then had any truth, we'll know soon enough." She also contacted her lawyer and gave him strict instructions to prepare for any backlash from Nelson's legal team. "This time," she said, "I won't be the one caught off guard." Meanwhile, she began moving her shares, calling in quiet favors, and reaching out to Daniel's mentors behind the scenes. She didn't need revenge. She needed truth. She didn't need drama. She needed clarity. What Nelson didn't know was that the woman he thought he had broken was no longer trying to escape. She was walking calmly toward him, with evidence, power, and a storm of truth that would not just bruise him, but finish him. Daniel's 18th birthday came with more than just balloons and cake. It came with a crown. According to Nelson's will, which had been carefully updated and sealed months ago, the full power of the company would now be transferred into Daniel's hands. Legacy must continue, Nelson had declared proudly at board meetings, boasting about how he had trained his son to be a reflection of his brilliance. What he didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't a reflection of him at all. He was a mirror of Amarachi, calm, strategic, and deeply respectful. He accepted the responsibility with grace, gave credit to his mentors and the staff, and most importantly, gave a private thanks to his mother. "Everything I know about leadership," he said at home that night, "I learned from watching how you held us together." Amarachi blinked back tears and kissed his forehead. "Make it count," she whispered. "Not for me, but for truth." The takeover ceremony was scheduled for a grand hall downtown. Nelson planned the event himself, obsessed with ensuring the world knew his name would echo through generations. "This is the moment I've been waiting for," he told friends. "To step back and let my son take over while I enjoy the good life." He spoke endlessly about retirement trips, his future new bride, and global expansion deals. Amarachi watched him from afar, listening quietly but not speaking. Her lawyer had confirmed it. Daniel was not Nelson's biological son. The DNA test had arrived just 2 days before the event, sealed and undeniable. And Amarachi knew exactly when and where to drop that truth. Not out of bitterness, but because Nelson had made legacy his entire identity. And it was time to show him that the legacy he built was never really his to begin with. In the days leading to the ceremony, Amarachi had long conversations with Daniel. She didn't reveal everything, but enough to prepare him. "There may be a moment," she told him, "where truth will try to hurt you. But remember who you are. You are not built on lies. You are built on integrity, on resilience, and on love." Daniel listened with solemn eyes. "Whatever it is, Mum," he said, "we'll face it together." On the day of the ceremony, He wore a suit Amarachi had tailored for him herself, navy blue with silver accents. Amarachi arrived in a flowing emerald gown that turned heads, strong, radiant, and unreadable. She didn't carry anger on her face. She carried finality. And as Nelson stood on that stage, preparing to announce his triumph to the world, Amarachi sat quietly, waiting for her moment, not to ruin him, but to reveal the truth he had buried under years of arrogance and mockery. The grand ballroom of Royal Crest Towers was packed with dignitaries, CEOs, shareholders, media houses, and family. Crystal chandeliers bathed the hall in golden light, and a massive LED screen displayed the words, "Legacy Lives On." The Nelson Group hands over to the next generation. Everything was, as Nelson wanted, prestigious, expensive, overdone. He wore a custom agbada stitched with gold thread, standing tall on the elevated stage like a king in his prime. Cameras clicked, journalists scribbled, and guests murmured their admiration. But none of them noticed the tension beneath the perfection. Amarachi entered last, escorted by Daniel, her emerald gown shimmering like dignity itself. She walked with grace, chin high, her steps deliberate. The entire hall turned to look, not because of her beauty, but because she walked like she owned something far more powerful than money: truth. As the ceremony began, Nelson delivered a long speech filled with pride and self-congratulation. He spoke about building the company from scratch, about sleepless nights and bold risks, and most importantly, about raising a son who would carry his legacy forward. "Daniel is my blood, my strength, and the future of this company," he declared. The audience applauded, but Daniel sat still, expression unreadable. Amarachi, from her seat, offered a faint smile. It wasn't bitter, it was mournful. She had watched this man go from dreamer to destroyer, from partner to predator. And now he stood, gloating over a life built from her sacrifices. But what he didn't know was that this would be the last time he'd speak about legacy without interruption. As the applause settled and Nelson gestured for Daniel to take the podium, a man in a charcoal suit stepped forward from the side of the hall, a lawyer Amarachi had hired. He carried an envelope sealed in red wax. The man raised his hand. "Before the heir is announced, a legal disclosure has been submitted by Mrs. Amarachi Nelson, permitted under the company's bylaws for personal claims that affect ownership." The room went silent. Nelson froze, unsure whether to laugh or protest. The lawyer opened the envelope and handed the document to the event moderator. A large screen behind the podium displayed the title, "Paternity Confirmation Report, Nelson Group Successor, Daniel Nelson." The crowd leaned forward as the moderator read aloud. "Based on results obtained from certified DNA testing, it is established that Mr. Nelson Kalechi is not the biological father of Mr. Daniel Nelson." Gasps echoed through the hall. Chairs scraped. A woman screamed in shock. And for the first time in 2 decades, Nelson's mouth fell open and stayed that way. His world, built on ego, lies, and image, began to unravel in public. And in the front row, Amarachi remained still, poised, powerful, and ready for the laugh that would change everything. Silence hung in the air like a suspended bomb, the only sound in the hall being the rustle of the paper as the moderator lowered the document with trembling hands. All eyes turned toward Nelson, who stood frozen in disbelief, his eyes darting between the screen, Amarachi, and Daniel. He looked like a man watching his empire burn in slow motion. His agbada now felt heavy, like the weight of betrayal, the collapse of an identity he had carefully constructed for years. Nelson's lips moved, but no sound came. Finally, he turned to Amarachi, who was now standing, calm, regal, unafraid. "You did this," he said, voice cracking with equal parts disbelief and rage. Amarachi walked forward, her heels echoing across the marble floor like a funeral drum. She stopped in front of him and said softly but firmly, "No, you did this. The day you mocked my womb. The day you laughed at my pain." The audience sat in stunned silence, watching a woman they once considered the quiet wife unveil a truth that shattered everything. Amarachi continued, her voice unwavering. "You claimed this boy was your legacy, that your bloodline must endure. But what endures isn't blood, it's honor, it's presence. It's love. And those things? You never gave them. Not to me. Not to him. She turned to the crowd now. While you were building an empire, I was raising a man. A man you ignored, mistreated, and used to polish your image. But let me ask you all, what kind of legacy is built on a lie? No one responded. They couldn't. Nelson stumbled back, clutching the side of the podium. His breathing grew shallow, and the confident glint in his eye had vanished, replaced by fear and confusion. This can't be true, he muttered. He looks like me. Amarachi looked at him and whispered, No. He looks like what you wish you were. And then came the laugh. Not loud, not bitter, but clear. Amarachi laughed once, then again, and the sound of it echoed louder than any insult Nelson had ever hurled at her. It was the laugh of a woman who had carried shame, pain, and silence for years, and now stood above it all. You mocked me for not carrying a child. But it turns out the child I carried wasn't yours, and he's still more of a man than you'll ever be. Daniel stepped forward then, not with rage, but with calm authority. He placed a hand on his mother's shoulder, then faced the crowd. My name is Daniel. I am not the son of a man who mocks women, who builds empires on betrayal, and who walks away from his responsibilities. I am my mother's son, and I stand proud. Applause broke out, not from all, but from enough. Nelson collapsed into the chair behind him, not physically defeated, but spiritually erased. Nelson sat motionless, hands trembling as murmurs rose around the room. The very people who once idolized him were now whispering, looking away in discomfort. Amarachi's laughter had done something no lawsuit, no scandal, no corporate betrayal had ever managed. It had broken him internally. For the first time in his life, Nelson felt something he could not manipulate, silence, or bury: exposure. It wasn't just that the child wasn't biologically his. It was that everything he had flaunted, his legacy, his manhood, his fatherhood, had crumbled in front of a room full of witnesses. His carefully crafted image had been reduced to dust. And Amarachi hadn't shouted, hadn't wept. She had simply told the truth and let it do the destruction. That laugh, echoing still in his ears, would haunt him longer than any prison sentence or fine. It was the sound of every insult returned, every slap in words reversed, every scar unveiled. Journalists scrambled to cover the breaking story. Security tried to contain the chaos, and Nelson's assistant, unsure what to do, simply backed away. But Amarachi walked away without looking back, escorted by Daniel, her head held higher than it had ever been. There were no insults thrown, no final warnings, just silence from the man who once believed he could break her spirit. The world had watched as Nelson's arrogance ate itself alive. And now, alone in the center of a collapsing dream, he whispered to no one, "She destroyed me." But it wasn't true. Amarachi hadn't destroyed him. He had destroyed himself the moment he laughed at a woman grieving her unborn child. He had destroyed himself when he called her cursed, broken, and disposable. All Amarachi had done was return his laugh, with truth. Later that evening, a video clip from the ceremony went viral. Not the speech, not the DNA reveal, but Amarachi's laugh. A haunting, beautiful, devastating laugh. People reposted it with captions like "the laugh that ended a tyrant," and "never underestimate a quiet woman." Nelson shut himself away for weeks, ignoring calls, canceling interviews, and trying to find a way to undo the damage. But there was none. The truth was out. And the world had moved on. His company remained, now under Daniel's full control, but his name had been removed from press releases, from product packaging, from every banner. Amarachi, on the other hand, was celebrated, quietly, not with awards or ceremonies, but with respect. And to her, that was enough. She didn't win by screaming. She won by surviving, by outlasting, and by telling the truth with the most powerful weapon a woman could wield: her silence, until it was time to speak. Days passed after the public unraveling of Nelson's false legacy, but the dust refused to settle. Nelson had become a ghost in his own empire, avoiding board meetings, locking himself in his mansion, and refusing interviews. His legal team advised damage control, but it was too late. Sponsors pulled out. Journalists published scathing editorials. How could a man lead a generation when he never knew his own bloodline? One headline read. Yet, amid the noise, Daniel stood firm. The young man had been prepared for this moment, not because he expected it, but because Amarachi had raised him to face truth with courage. At the next company town hall, standing before over 200 staff members, Daniel addressed the storm. Yes, the man I called father is not my biological father, but that doesn't change who I am. I was raised by a woman who never lied, never abandoned, and never quit. If you need proof of leadership, look at her. The room was silent, but filled with emotion. Staff who had once bowed to Nelson's authority now stood with respect for the son he claimed yet never nurtured. Daniel continued, "A man once told me that legacy is in blood, but I've learned that legacy is in integrity, in action, in how you treat people behind closed doors." He paused, his eyes meeting those of longtime staff members who had witnessed Nelson's coldness. "Everything I've learned, every success I've had, it came from watching a woman survive what would have destroyed others. My mother didn't break. She became a blueprint." The applause that followed wasn't just for Daniel. It was for Amarachi, who was now seated in the front row, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with silent tears. Tears not of pain, but of release, of victory, and most importantly, of peace. Later that evening, as they returned home, Daniel sat with his mother in the living room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan their only company. "You were right," he said gently. "Truth isn't about shouting. It's about timing." Amarachi nodded slowly, taking his hand. "And healing," she replied. "Truth doesn't just free you. It heals what lies tried to bury." Daniel looked at her and asked the one question he had never dared to before. "Do you regret keeping me?" Amarachi's response came without hesitation. "Never. You were the one good thing that came from all of it. And now you are the one thing that will rebuild everything he tried to ruin." In that quiet room, with no cameras, no applause, and no drama, a son and a mother held hands, not in survival, but in triumph. Amarachi had given him life, and now he had given her something back, her name. Months passed. The media storm faded, replaced by newer scandals and younger headlines. But Amarachi's story lingered in quiet corners of conversations, spoken with reverence and curiosity. Nelson was rarely seen. Rumor had it he sold his mansion and moved out of the country, retreating to a quiet villa where no one asked about DNA or legacy. He had lost everything: reputation, respect, and most painfully, the illusion that he was the architect of his success. Alone in a cold house with his regrets, Nelson finally understood the depth of his failure. It wasn't just that Daniel wasn't his blood. It was that he had spent years discarding the only person who ever truly believed in him. Amarachi hadn't ruined him. She had simply stopped protecting him from himself. And that absence was what shattered him. Meanwhile, Amarachi's world blossomed. Not in extravagance or fame, but in small, powerful ways. She started mentoring young women, privately, without public announcements. She funded business grants for wives who had helped build empires only to be discarded. She wrote a memoir quietly titled The Womb You Mocked, not to shame Nelson, but to speak to women who had endured the same. It sold thousands of copies through word of mouth alone. She traveled occasionally, often invited to speak at events she once sat silently through. But she never told her full story. That power she reserved for her son. Daniel, now firmly in control of the company, transformed it with transparency and innovation. Shareholders trusted him. Employees respected him. And through it all, he always made space for his mother at every milestone. "She's not just my mother," he said at a major tech launch. "She's the foundation of this company." One morning, while sipping tea on the balcony of her new home, modest, serene, with a garden full of sunflowers, Amarachi looked out over the quiet estate. There was no noise, no chaos, just the breeze, the laughter of birds, and the warmth of healing. She closed her eyes and let the sun touch her skin. Not as the wife of a man who once mocked her, not as the woman who had to prove her worth, but as Amarachi, whole, respected, free. She didn't need to burn bridges. She had simply built a better one and walked across it. And as the wind danced through the leaves and the world carried on outside her gate, she whispered something only the sky could hear. Let them laugh at broken wombs. Because sometimes the child who isn't yours will become the lesson you never saw coming. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.